Welcome to episode 4 of Neuro and Beyond. Today's episode is titled, It's Not Just Me.
Or you, or me.
Or her.
Or
him.
Yes, finding our own uniqueness, but something that is relatable to so many more people on the planet than we think.
Yeah, and those thoughts that you have swirling around your head, and you're thinking, I can't tell anybody this. It's just, what? Oh, they're going to think I'm an idiot. They're going to think I'm weird. If you're thinking it, guarantee you somebody else is thinking it.
Yeah.
And this came out of a conversation this morning. Our pre-recording, pre-podcast chat, post 2, not the one in the car, but the one in the living room.
Yeah.
Honestly, we spent about 3 hours talking before we actually get to recording anything.
We're digging for treasure. That's
we
what we do.
We're looking, digging for gold, trying to find those diamonds in the rough.
Yeah.
This came out of me being late diagnosed ADHD and having spent a lifetime of keeping quiet and not voicing what's going on in here for fear of ridicule, I suppose, for want of a better word, to then get my diagnosis at the age of 47 and feeling like I'm looking at the world through a different set of lenses that makes me then, or has allowed me to then look into all those experiences and how I was looking at something, how I was, and the thoughts that generated, and how I wasn't dealing with them. It was pushing it deep down, like keeping it inside, pushing it down. But there comes a point where you're full. There is nowhere else for this information to go. And so you replay it around and round in your head, usually when you lay your head on the pillow. So today, we really wanted to talk about how important communication is, and how, those of us who have had that late diagnosis can become really confused or conflicted about what we do now. So I'm happy to say, well, I'm not happy to say, I'm happy to share that my communication ability pre-diagnosis was pretty poor. This led to relationship problems, because I think anybody who's ever lived with anybody, we've all been aware of the rolled eyes, the huffing, the going around banging things, tidying up. So, am I picking up on something? Which then obviously sets you into a heightened alert and emotional state. And from the point of the diagnosis I got, my wife and I, we were able to change the way we communicated, because she could now understand that the reason I struggled to communicate was, one, I wasn't understanding the prompts. I was picking up on all these microaggressions, which she probably wasn't aware of doing. She may be aware of doing. But I don't blame her for it at all, living with somebody who was ADHD and didn't know it. And we had a very clear conversation where I was finally able to honestly and without fear or judgment express why I had trouble expressing myself. And that was a real turning point. So when we communicate now, we are very clear on what we're trying to say. Because I think often, as particularly couples who are busy, working, kids, all these other things going on, communication takes a bit of a backseat, and we kind of expect our partner to be telepathic. And whilst we are to a degree in the fact that we pick up that they're not happy, we don't really know what's going on, and we're all guilty of it. So having that, I suppose, fresh start, I think I have to look at it as a fresh start. It enabled us to set boundaries and agree on a means of communicating. So if we used to fall out, which used to be quite frequent, not the loud banging, shouting, screaming, but the very quiet, insular, avoiding each other, which always leaves an unpleasant atmosphere. And they were often never settled. It was just like, it would just roll. And then you wake up and it's like, new day, carry on. So when those would come to a head, I wouldn't be able to communicate because my brain wouldn't work quick enough to find the words to express the frustration I was feeling, which then led to more frustration, which in my place turned into frustration at myself, anger at the situation, and would result in me leaving the house. I would storm out, which would then trigger a chain of events in my head that were extreme, ranging from I'm going to get divorced, I'm going to kill myself, that's the only way out of this, I'm going to end my life, that is it, I'm done, to okay, well, I'm going to get divorced, that means I'm probably going to be homeless now because I wasn't working, so I had no income. And obviously being a man, you're not put at the top of the list for housing. So, right, I'm going to be homeless. And I go through this whole range, this whole story in my head until I got to the point where that all got out of my system. And then I was just left with embarrassment and shame. And then I would walk around for hours and I wouldn't answer my phone because I was too embarrassed and I didn't know how to start that conversation of re-engaging. But post-diagnosis, I was able to say, in those situations, I just need space. I need time to gather my thoughts. I need time to be able to respond in a calm and measured manner. So we came up with using a code word. So whenever I felt that I was being backed into a corner, and I really want to make it clear that it is not my partner's fault. She was not being aggressive to me, but my rejection sensitivity made me feel that I was being pushed into a corner. And when you get pushed into a corner, you do one of two things. You run away or you attack. And attack is not in my nature, so I would run away. So now, although I can honestly say we haven't been in that situation for months, which is wonderful. Now we have that code word. So when I do feel that I'm going into that, or we're getting into that space where I'm feeling on edge, upset, or on the end of aggression as I see it, I say the code word, and immediately my wife can recognise ADHD. Okay, now that's not ADHD as an excuse, but it's ADHD as he can't process this situation right now. And so I'm going to give him space to let him calm down, understand how he's feeling and what he wants to say. And it feels that sounds like a very long-winded process, but it happens like that. I'm never good at clicking my fingers. I'm quite glad that came out. But that's why understanding, so this links really nicely back into our last podcast about why it's important to get a diagnosis. Because when you get your diagnosis, yes, there's lots of upsetting things, past traumas, things that, a life lost or time wasted, whatever you want to say, but it really gives the opportunity to understand what's going on inside your head and in your relationships. And as soon as you're then in a position to understand how you're feeling, you can then communicate it better to those around you and your loved ones. And we've been communicating since we were apes.
Yeah.
And we've only got worse at it. I'm sure we're probably at the point in society or in our evolution where we've got all the technology we could possibly need to communicate, but we are probably worse at communicating now than we ever have been.
Yeah. It reminds me as you tell your story of communication. It reminds me of mine when from when I was a kid. My dad was on the spectrum, but he was never diagnosed. That generation was way before all of this
Didn't exist back
awareness.
then.
It didn't. But he definitely, I see now, he definitely was on the spectrum, and he had I'd say clinical paranoia as well, which was hidden and covered over by my mum. And he won't mind me talking about him now because he's passed over and he says to me it's okay. So I'm what I got to understand sort of later on in my life, because I found it very difficult to understand my dad and to live with him and to communicate with him. And I understand now that I had to get to grips with that he had a different language to me, and him being male, different to being female as a fundamental basis. Then on top of that was his being on the spectrum, and whatever I don't know what particularly I could label him with, but there was lots. I had to go back over my experiences in my childhood and to hear him in a different way. So the things he said to me, the things how he treated me in some situations, I had to go back and re-listen to what he was saying. And that difference, that accepting his communication being a different language to mine, brought me peace with how it happened. And my dad ended up now as being, I would say, one of my greatest teachers, even though is the one that caused me a lot of pain and a lot of shame for lots of different reasons. But now I get it. So that communication, that language, I now, when I'm speaking with people who I know are neurodivergent, and there's a lot of my family around me, and your good self, of course, I attempt to get my head into the communication language as you attempt to get your head into that communication language, so we can both speak the same words and understand each other. So there's two different points of view there that I'd say have the same intention of communication and expression, to understand and connect with each other.
Yeah, and I think what you touched upon there is like sometimes the hardest things that we live through, that it can take a long time, but ultimately they can turn into the things you learn the most from. About yourself, largely about yourself. And for me, whenever I think about that, I think about the things that I've experienced which I thought was some of the things that I experienced in life I thought were terribly unfair. I did have the why me rather a lot, but I can look at it through this new lens and say, well, actually, do you know what? All those things, they've given me a greater awareness of the importance of people, interpretation, communication, and resilience. And I think I quite comfortably say we're both very resilient people, and that wouldn't have happened if we hadn't gone through all these things that were very painful for a very long time. But I think that's the great thing, that when you get this clarity, the world opens up, and I see quite. I'm a member of a few forums on social media, particularly for or rather, a lot of the commenters are people who, particularly men, because those are the groups I tend to be part of, who have been diagnosed later in life and are in this absolute turmoil, that they haven't reached that stage yet of being able to look through that different lens, and because there isn't the person, or there isn't the group, or there isn't the facility to help them come to terms with it, because not everybody can just walk into a psychiatrist's office and have weekly therapy.
No.
And that's why one of the reasons I wanted to do this podcast is to share my experience and Angela's experience with neurodiversity and coaching and training and all the other amazing skills that she has to help those guys navigate this kind of this path, because they're not communicated with. They're not generally not very good communicators. I work for a men's mental health charity. I'm well aware of high suicide rates in men, and a lot of that is down to they don't feel they can communicate.
Yeah.
But it also leads into how us as neurodivergents deal with things, whether particularly on an emotional level. I don't want to feel like I'm sort of leaping ahead or leaping away from what we're talking about, but all of this, there is emotion attached. And I think as neurodivergents, we react very differently to neurotypicals in these situations, or situations where you're put in or you're experiencing difficulty. I think with a lot of neurotypicals, they can see what it is, they can plan, they can ask for support, they can make changes, they can, it's hardwired. It's not an issue. But when you're neurodivergent and your brain isn't on that same wavelength, when it comes to emotions, we talked earlier, and grief was one that came up, and I think we've both experienced grief in very different ways, but nonetheless very real. But experiencing other people's grief,
yeah,
is I find it really difficult, in that I feel separated. I don't feel. As I'm laughing as I do that when I'm uncomfortable. I don't feel it in terms of when we've had people pass. I'm very practical with it, and it's like, oh, okay, but I'm very aware of the grief of the people around me, and I can carry on as well. But at the funeral, I will suddenly get a huge overwhelm of emotion, not at the sadness of that person not being here anymore, but of the people around me.
Yeah, that's one point of the neurodiversity that I find is inextricably linked with what's seen to be psychic ability, is that empathy for other people, that empathic connection, and the those that do psychic or therapies with people on an energetic level are taught to shield themselves energetically, to not take on all that emotion. And I think that the two are one and the same. And my question would be, would it not be beneficial for us to teach neurodivergent children how to manage their energetic system to be better equipped to be in the most challenging of places will be in a church at a funeral, to be in that space and be able to manage more effectively their energetic system, so they didn't take on as much of somebody else's powerful, crushing grief and emotion. That's not just a question for you. That would be my question.
Well, I think that's something that we could all learn from. It's that thing of when there are so many emotions. It's not just happiness, sadness, anger. There's lots of them, and as a neurodivergent, I don't pick up on them. I can tell if someone's laughing, I can tell if someone's crying, I can tell if sadness or happiness.
Yeah.
But it's all the ones in between. I can't differentiate between them, and that makes socializing or being in a social environment really challenging, particularly if there's a lot of people around. And I think even, as a child, I remember being confused about how I should be feeling. And I'd be looking around, and I would look at, looking around at everyone going, well, what's everyone else feeling? What's everyone else looking like? And I'm not actually feeling it. I'm just working through the mechanics of it.
Yeah.
And so it's not, I wasn't being emotional. It's like the very opposite of emotional. I was being mechanical.
Yeah.
And I'd say that to a degree that's carried on today. I'm very good. Sorry, I'm very boasting. I'm very good at being around people who are sad. No, that sounds awful. I'm very good. I suppose that, one of the things they say is like, if you've got a crisis, you want a neurodivergent in there because that's what we've trained our whole lives for. It's like, no, it's fine, I'll deal with it. House on fire, it's fine, I'll deal with it. That's someone's collapsed, I'll go and deal with it. It's absolutely fine. I'm unflappable.
Yeah.
But it's but it creates all these problems in other areas. That how do you deal with the day to day? How do you and I'm going to say this particularly men, because that's where being a man, but also finding myself around men who have struggled with their mental health. I've spoken to a lot of men who are later on in life, 50s, 60s, 70s plus, who have had a whole lifetime of carrying this burden of not being able to express themselves or show weakness. And it might feel like this is absolutely my ADHD. I bounce from thing to thing, and sometimes I'm worried that there's not a continuous thread. And I'm sure Angela will tell me there is. She always holds the threads as I ramble and go off everywhere. She pulls me back in. But they've carried this burden their whole life of being the man, being the responsible, being the person that everybody can rely on. And it takes a toll. And when they've come along to the walks that the charity does, you see a different side of them. And I think it's an awakening for them of being able to share emotion with other men, because we're all led to believe that we should be strong. And if we're not strong, if we show even a hint of emotion, then we'll get vilified for it. We'll have people take the piss. It'll be embarrassing. You'll be seen as weak. There is such a stigma attached to it. But they come along, and I meet other blokes who, we're not, I'm not going to use the alpha beta thing because it's crap. But we've got firearms officers, we've got firemen, we've got rugby players, we've got, people from historically masculine, who participate in masculine pursuits and talking openly about their feelings and what's troubling them. And that level of vulnerability is, I think, sometimes a shock to them because they've never been in that situation before, where these men who you would see perhaps on paper as hypermasculine, talking about something very emotive and emotional. They're like not talking about their favourite football team and how they lost the league on the last game of the season, but generally about the things that are troubling them and are causing them issues. And in time, it allows them to then feel it's okay to show a level of vulnerability, because and this is key to say, and I think it really needs to be reiterated, being vulnerable isn't the same as being weak. The amount of strength that it takes for somebody to open up about the one thing, their dirty, dark secret, which it isn't, but to them it is, that they've been carrying, and they can talk to somebody about it, the emotional release of that, you can see it in their physicality. You can see when somebody turns up, when someone's carrying a burden, they're hunched, they're low, their face is drawn, their face is down, hunched in on themselves. They get that out, and there's a new posture. It's the chin's a bit higher up, the shoulders are a bit further back. The face is, not saying they're beaming, but you can see that there is a tangible change in them. And I think even with neurodiversity aside, men in general, I think the message is getting better. There is still the horrific statistics about suicide being the leading cause of death in males. And if we can get men talking and opening up, like the guys in the neurodivergence forums, asking the questions. I'm feeling like this. Is anybody else? Yes, we are. It is not only you. It is not only me.
Does anybody else speak my language?
And you'd be bloody surprised that there are a lot of us out there who are thinking the same things, feeling the same things, and just need somebody to communicate that with, somebody who else is going through a similar situation, because there is help out there. And I think, it might not be the person closest to you. It might be a complete stranger. It might be tuning in and listening to a podcast and listening to two random strangers talking about life experiences. But if it brings you comfort, I think it's a wonderful thing. And the more of us who are open to talking about our experiences, I will talk to anybody and everybody about my mental health experience, my ADHD journey. That is definitely a neurodivergent thing in oversharing. So I will probably say too much, but I refuse to feel guilty about it anymore.
No, absolutely.
If I was to leave one message to men and women and anybody else, is talk, speak. You will find the right person. You might not find them straight away, but the only way that you will ever deal with what's going on is to ask for help. And there are lots of amazing organisations that are there specifically to help you, aside from your GP and the organisations. If you are in a very dark place, you have the Samaritans. If you're struggling with mental health, there's organisations like Mind and Men Walk Talk, and there's all the Neuro-divergent charities. There is help there. Just don't be afraid to ask, because they are waiting for you to ask the question.
So is that the one thing that tipped you over into the awareness and the awakening that you show now? Is that talk? What was the moment?
For me, it was when I was post what I call my big breakdown, where there was nowhere else to go. I was at the end. I was literally making that decision that was the end. And in that moment, my brain kicked in. I believe it's a form of self-preservation of the brain that made me stop what I was doing. And it was shortly after that I found the charity Men Walk Talk on Facebook. It was brand new in my local area. And I looked at it and it was just like mental health, guys walking. So, okay. Now, it took me a few attempts because I'd become quite isolated by that point. I was struggling to leave the house. I was really in a very bad place. But after a few failed attempts, I made it to one of the group walks. And I want to say it was a bit of I think it was a bit of an epiphany for me. because I am of that generation where we don't talk.
Yeah.
I am of that generation where, you know, if you do, you're weak, and or it's viewed, it was viewed that way. But I went along and I met guys across the spectrum of ages talking about mental health, talking about what was troubling them, not necessarily looking for answers, but just to get it out of here. Because when you get it out of here, this is an echo chamber. You only ever hear your own voice.
Yeah.
You only ever hear your thoughts, your own thoughts. Get it out of here, and it's out in the world. Yes, then it's real. And then you can start looking at it. And then you can be objective about it. And you can get other people's thoughts on it. And for me, that first walk, I would credit with the first step of my recovery from mental health problems. I wouldn't say I'm fully recovered, but I'm in a position where I'm very comfortable. I will always be very conscious of how I feel. But that's again the ADHD thing, which is another. There was another pivotal moment for that. So I think there's always pivotal. There's wherever you go through in life, there are. I think you can count on multiple pivotal moments in that scenario. But for me, that one where I went to that walk and I could talk about how I felt, and I wasn't judged. Nobody was looking at me like I had a second head. There was no joking. There was no. I'm not saying it was. It wasn't like dead serious. Nobody's like. It wasn't. It was just so welcoming, and it was. And there's groups like that across the country, all different groups, led by men and women who have the same shared experience or similar shared experiences. And it's taking that first step, and it's not easy, and it can be the biggest step you've had to take to date.
Yeah.
But once you've done it, oh my God, what a difference that can make to you. And it's that communicating, it's vocalizing what's going on up here, because you can't always trust what your head's telling you. It's there's that little voice inside that's quite negative. It's negative Nelly. So I would say find somewhere, find a group. You won't necessarily find the right one straight away, but doesn't mean stop trying, because you will find your tribe, you will find your people, you will find a group of people who are or it could just be one person that you hit absolutely a connection with, and that can be the difference between life and death.
Perfect.
So go and do it.
Yeah.